You see, you're conceiving of acceptance as an activity of your mind. And acceptance is something, if only I could be more accepting, then such and such. But true acceptance is not an activity of the mind. It is the nature of awareness. True acceptance is not something we can do or practice with our minds. We have to see, go behind the mind to discover the awareness that is behind the mind, that its nature is already accepting. That is, its nature is already open, without resistance. The separate self that wants to practice acceptance simply perpetuates itself by doing so, and therefore perpetuates the suffering that is its offspring. You want your inner child to be put to rest. You want the separate self to be consoled. It's not possible. There's no such thing as a separate self or ego or inner child that is at rest. It's not possible. The rest you seek is the dissolution of the separate self. It's not even the dissolution of the separate self, because there is no separate self there in the first place to be dissolved. The only reason there seems to be a separate self is because we haven't looked clearly enough. Almost all our thinking and feeling revolve around a phantom self, which when looked for is not there. It's not that there is nothing there. It's not that there is nothing to the sense of I or self. There is something. The word I or self does refer to something that is experienced. But it refers to this unlimited consciousness. That is the great discovery. To discover that what we call self or I is nothing in the sense that it is not a thing, but it is not just a blank, empty void. It is consciousness. It is full of consciousness, and that consciousness is without limits. That discovery is the disappearance of the non-existent little child, and then all the little child's problems disappear with it. Why does this little child or separate self seem to be present? It's simply because our culture has educated us to think and feel of ourselves in this way. Everything about our culture encourages us to believe and feel you are a temporary, finite self. And being a temporary self, you fear death. Being a finite self, you feel lack. So these are the two essential forms of the separate self: the fear of death, because we feel temporary, and the sense of lack, because we feel finite. And everything the separate self does, it does to allay its sense of fear, the fear that I'm going to die, or to fulfill its sense of lack. I need this, I want this, if only I had that, a relationship, a state, an object. All the separate self is really longing for is not an object or a state or a substance or a relationship. It's longing to come to an end as a separate self. It's longing to be divested of its sense of separation. That is the longing to go home. So when you say your inner child wants to be met, it's not really what you want. You want your inner child to be dissolved. An ego that is met is just an ego that has been lulled to sleep, that has been temporarily soothed, has quietened down a bit, but it'll wake up again. So what sometimes appears to be a compassionate teaching is a teaching that puts the ego to sleep. And what sometimes appears to be a teaching that is a little more stringent, a little less tolerant of the separate self, is a teaching that really gives the separate self what it wants, which is to die, to dissolve. Or rather, for the self to be relieved of its sense of separation. That is what the self is longing for. And the most efficient way that I know to affect that dissolution is to look at this self that we consider ourselves to be. To find this inner child that wants to be consoled. It's not there. What we find if we try to find this separate self around whom our thoughts and feelings and subsequently our activities and relationships revolved is not a temporary finite consciousness living in the body. We find this open, empty, spacious presence. It finds itself, it recognizes itself in us. That is the experience of peace for which the separate self longs.